Ireland has a built-in geographic advantage when it comes to defence, not a natural one like the mountains of Switzerland or the wildlife of Australia, but rather a man-made one. This is because Ireland is not a member of NATO, but de facto benefits from the alliance, because Ireland being invaded would be bad news for the United Kingdom or Western Europe, and so they get the military protection despite being militarily neutral with relatively little spending on it. 20 different countries claim to be neutral, but neutrality is often misrepresented as seeing everything as perfectly equal, but it's actually more like refusing to take a side in international conflicts that don't involve you. When your friend and girlfriend are about to fight, you probably know who's right, but would be better off not intervening on their side, because then you'd incur the wrath of, let's be honest, your girlfriend. Neutrality really exists on a scale though, and there are countries which have no military, but then there are also countries like Switzerland. Switzerland is the country which has been neutral for the longest. It predates the modern definition and codifying of neutrality from the Hague Convention of 1907 by literally hundreds of years, but it also forces people to serve in its military. I say people, but really I mean men, of course, because it's optional for women. Also, Switzerland says this of its neutrality: the law of neutrality applies to international conflicts, but not to internal conflicts, which the majority of conflicts currently represent. The law of neutrality does not apply to a military operation authorized by the UNSC, for the latter is acting under a mandate from a community of states in order to re-establish peace and international security. So to Switzerland, neutrality means protecting themselves or potentially protecting countries, but not engaging in wars for the sake of benefiting more nebulous goals, which seems pretty solid, right? But while you're in the EEA anyway, it's also worth mentioning there are 4 other explicitly neutral countries. Austria was given an offer by Stalin, which was that they'd be allowed to exist in exchange for just being neutral, something they have stuck to this day, while Finland was given a similar offer by Stalin, just really quietly in a way that no one else could hear, and so after the invasion of World War II, and after the aftermath, they lost some of their territory and had to agree to be neutral, but it did end up being a much better fate than all of the other republics that border the USSR got. Sweden is also an interesting example of being more nuanced about neutrality. They spent most of the European wars perfectly sandwiched between 2 alliances and basically just decided to stay out of it all after their empire days were gone. This doesn't mean they didn't make exceptions to their policy, but fortunately they were always on the right side of history on that one. Oh. No, sorry, I mean the far right side of history. Ireland also gets a lot of crap for effectively being pro-bad mustache man, in effect by being neutral, but actually their neutrality was mostly to the benefit of the Allies, who could always escape any internments in the country by fleeing north, as there was, and still is, no real border controls between the 2 nations. To be fair to the Irish though, the reason they are neutral is not to freeload off the United Kingdom, or NATO you might say, but it's effectively because of the United Kingdom. Allowing the Free State to be independent was only considered allowable on any level because of the idea of it not becoming a military power of its own, as it might then side against the UK and become a tactical disadvantage. By the time Ireland was invited to NATO after World War II had concluded, they'd started seeing the benefits and decided they liked neutrality now that it was swinging in their direction. The opinion of Ireland not wanting to join any alliance that the United Kingdom was going to be a part of sounds like it's a very principled stance, but in reality works out more or less in almost everyone's favour, but especially the Irish, and therefore it benefits almost everyone in the same way you might argue that we'd all benefit if every country is neutral, but that's a bigger idea than this video is going to be talking about, because forcing a country to be neutral seems made up, but many countries have been created under similar conditions, notably Belgium. But how well did that go? For the very same mustache man reasons. Wow, are you telling me that just establishing a bunch of small neutral states between big powers isn't the way that you get global peace? I was starting to think that 100 more Liechtensteins around the world was the solution to all of our woes, but now I don't know what to think, especially about Iceland, which is one of the smallest countries not considered to be a micronation, and it's a fun example of neutrality by the definition that most people think of, as the country has no armed forces whatsoever. Despite this, they are not actually officially neutral, as they are a full NATO member, but instead of offering guns or tanks to the alliance, they offer the very useful location relative to the North Atlantic that the treaty is named after. The interesting thing about their membership is that the last country they fought a war with was in the alliance, and so too was the last country that invaded them. Sorry about that, by the way, guys. I promise we won't do it again. unless we find out there's kebabs to be had in doing so, in which case all bets are off. But there actually are substantially more countries that don't have a military than those that are neutral. But it's not like, looking at this map, any of these countries are actually going to be assisting in a World War III anyway. No offense, Tuvalu. Actually, you know what? Offense intended, Tuvalu. You're really going to exist in the middle of nowhere, making money from the TV domain instead of actually doing anything, and then stand on the sidelines if there was an event similar to the Holocaust happening? I'm going to take a bold stance against my Tuvalu learn viewers and tell you to stop fence sitting and pick a damn side. I just checked and I actually have 0 Tuvaluan viewers, so... More seriously though, I think we can all agree that given the lack of donor-making facilities on the island, Tuvalu is unlikely to ever be invaded, and so no military is actually a smart way to save some money. And so before we dive into the biggest country that's neutral with no military, it might be worth talking about why countries even have militaries to begin with. The value of a country's military is a hard one to really define. Oftentimes the value is seen as the existence of a country, something which is easily disproven by countries with no military that exist just fine. That is, if you can call living in the middle of the ocean without kebabs fine, but indeed, these countries can't be dragged into alliances that would compel them to go to war on another country's behalf, such as the one that Canada and Estonia have, or Poland and France do. Not having to defend France in a war sounds like a big plus to me. Also, why does France need Poland's help when it literally has nukes? This is making the assumption that the only reason people fight is to destroy other countries, but also that the only reason to go to war in the first place is to kill civilians and topple governments, when really that's about 90%. A lot of military action, though, exists to safeguard interests abroad. This often means securing trade, for example by protecting one of the world's most important canals from piracy, or by making sure a foreign country doesn't seize your country's assets abroad. Generally, countries don't disagree with the existence of other nations, but just disagree about a particular part and who it belongs to, and without a bunch of men with swords to defend your border, you might find part of your land belongs to China now. This means that a military only makes sense if you do a substantial amount of trade with other countries or have a real probability of your stuff being messed with. Otherwise, it's about as good as a shot glass, something that might happen if you're in a war actually, but the bulk of military spending operates more or less as a deterrent, as if you're measuring military action and objectives achieved directly, it'd be fair to say that nuclear weapons are an absolute waste, and it's annoying that the use of force is basically always measured this way. From police to prison to the Pope, there is an argument that whatever force is used by a state or government actor, that its value is not in the times it is used, but rather in the times it doesn't have to be used because people are fearful of it being used. And this is a really messy situation to try and measure any of those things and argue should they be increased or decreased, because maybe if we didn't have any amount, we would have a lawless world and everything would fall apart, and therefore it's worth almost everything, or maybe the exact number of crimes happen regardless, and on the international stage it's the exact same argument. If you reduced your military by 50%, you might argue that your country is just as well protected, or maybe reducing your military budget by just 10% is enough to embolden those who would act against you to steal some valuable piece of landmass from you. This is a tragic thing that does happen in the real world. I mean, particularly if you have that one big country on your border. I mean, they have the biggest land area. You've got to suspect they're going to come after you, and so rather than talking about countries like Switzerland that spend a whole lot on ensuring the Geneva Conventions don't have to be used to defend Geneva, today we'll talk instead about the interesting case of countries that do sort of prove the opposite, because the biggest country that doesn't have a military is Greenland. If you just use the wrong definition of country and therefore military, even if you assume that their independence is imminent, there's no real indication they wouldn't want a military, as they hold some very valuable territory with next to nobody there to defend it. And so instead, the most valuable country that's unprotected, the biggest country in the real sense of the word country and the real sense of the word biggest, is Costa Rica, which has no military, is a member of no alliance, and is generally neutral, which is mostly fine, but has resulted in more than a few odd situations, notably the border crisis, which is often called the Google Maps War, and so I feel the best way to explain that is by coming back to Google Maps. And so, hello, I'm Toycat, and welcome back to the second channel geography video, I guess, and this is inside of how countries work, because something about Costa Rica that's funny to me is how does it even work when it's such a funkily shaped country? It's something I think everyone should be asking. Seriously, look at this island right here. It looks like it's detached from the rest of it, but it just functions out there in the middle of nowhere, and also the country functions despite having a lot of straight line borders, something which are generally discouraged for being kind of hard to enforce. However, Costa Rica's issue is not with any of that, because they have a very good relationship, especially with their neighbor to the north, except when their neighbor to the north decides that actually they're going to cross into their country. Nicaragua did walk into Costa Rica because they thought, yeah, this is definitely our territory. This is definitely our territory. And they walked across some territory that Google Maps told them was also theirs. At least that was their official explanation. They said there was a bug in Google, and that's all they were doing there. And for a lot of the time, people made fun of this, like, yep, Google Maps caused an invasion. It was a big deal at the time. You might recall if you followed this channel a good 10 years ago now, as weird as that is to say. But something interesting about this is that later it was revealed that the reason Nicaraguans were there was not an accident, but actually they were taking advantage of the wording of how the border between these countries goes. You see, with a straight line, you have to look at GPS points, or you have to measure something very particularly and say there to there is the border, which is usually the worst way to do things because you get all sorts of geographic anomalies. However, when it comes to rivers and mountains, you generally define the river as being the border. This is something that works pretty well until the river changes course, and this river changing course is why the border is technically slightly inland from Nicaragua to Costa Rica, and that is also, interestingly enough, what Nicaragua figured that they could do to connect their territory with their other bit of territory, because they saw this old river on Google Maps. You can see that it doesn't really exist anymore, and they had heard that this was the old way, because the border was officially defined as being this river all the way until it reaches the sea, I guess, from the river to the sea, if you wanted to simplify that one down and definitely not have any controversial thoughts about it, but also that they owned this lagoon. And so they figured logically, if they own this lagoon anyway, then the river that goes out to the sea in the shortest path should logically be the one that also gives them the lagoon. And so they were here to dredge this river out again and to make sure that the shortest path would give them some more territory. Honestly, if you take this like several steps further, you could you could really, if you were willing to just do a little bit of an illegal invasion and hope no one noticed, you could really take a country under your control by just making shorter and shorter paths across the country. This isn't what they did though. They were just trying to redig this trench, and that is what led to the big International Court of Justice case, where this area was basically the dispute. When the treaty was signed, Nicaragua believes that this was meant to be the border, whereas Costa Rica believes this was meant to be the border, and you can see how both arguments have a little bit of water, or rather a lot of water in the Caribbean Sea, but they have a little bit of validity to them, and so they went to the ICJ. There was a lot of cases, and eventually they ruled that, yeah, Nicaragua, you shouldn't have invaded Costa Rica, and also you're gonna have to pay their legal fees. They disagreed a lot about what the legal fees were going to be, but this is what happened in the end. Costa Rica got their coast, but Nicaragua eventually, after another counterclaim, they eventually got to keep this lagoon over here, which means this lagoon, none of the land, just the lagoon, is Nicaragua, but all of the land around it is Costa Rica. Indeed, you can see just how wacky these these borders actually are, and how almost little sense they make in the real world, but that's not what they need to do. Instead, that just prevents Nicaragua coming in and taking some extra land, which they might want if they were to, say, build a canal. Wow, it would be crazy if they were planning one of those. And so, yeah, this is a very, very big deal for Nicaragua and Costa Rica, but ultimately, to come back to the start of this, it actually proves that Costa Rica doesn't need a military, because when they were invaded by a foreign power, the country just said, oh, sorry, Google Maps bug, we will leave right now. They didn't say, haha, what are you going to do about it? Even though on a force basic level, they could have done so. Ultimately, if you really think about it, another country could just go in and invade Costa Rica, but do they actually want to? Really, you could say that having a military is therefore defunct, because when there are courts that will just decide this stuff for you, it doesn't make too much sense. Until what if the courts decide something like this? Wow, do you see this? The UN court rules the UK has no sovereignty over the Chagos Islands, and the UK obviously doesn't have a military, so they don't back that one up or anything. However, I went and looked at the Chagos Islands just to be sure, and what do you know? This looks suspiciously like the one in that article right there, and wow, it looks like it's still the British Indian Ocean territory, and this is still part of the UK in the weirdest twist of fate ever. Oh, there's this lovely park that you can go for a walk on if you're in the UK and not in Mauritius, as the UN, as the International Court of Justice officially says. The Maritime Law Tribunal says that there is no sovereignty, but also the UK has not only traditional military, but also nuclear weapons, and does not agree to those rulings. and just says, yeah, we didn't sign up for anything binding, so good luck enforcing that. You can rule the laws all you like, but ultimately, laws only work as much as there is force to back them up. When two countries agree that they don't want to use force, such as Nicaragua and Costa Rica, you don't need any. However, when you look into, say, the history of the most powerful military powers, we could make the point about Russia again and their thought about laws, but ultimately look into the United States and how, sometimes when the laws need to be bent to match the reality of the world they like to make, sometimes that tends to happen. You could argue the very existence of the United States was an illegal move at some point in time, but laws have to, if they want to represent the real world, follow the real situation, which ultimately at some point has force attached to it, and that is why countries have militaries. But if you're Costa Rica, it looks like you can do fine without one. There are lots of compelling cases for why you would or wouldn't need a military, but if you're gonna have one, the best bet is probably actually just to stay neutral. Good job, Switzerland, you nailed that. This is unrelated, but I have to say it at some point in this video, or I'll be mad at myself and want to say it forever. But Switzerland is so ready to defend itself that every single entrance in and out of the country has explosive charges always wired there, so that at a moment's notice they can cut themselves off from the world again. There might be incredibly open borders between, say, Geneva and France, but they're willing to close those borders real soon if it ever comes to it, which I think is a lot of fun. Speaking of a lot of fun, I hope you all enjoyed this one, and I've been having a lot of fun with this series so far. I'm looking forward to discussing some more topics to hopefully explain to you why countries do the things that they do, because if you want to understand political geography, if you want to understand why countries are the way they are, there are some useful things that it's worth understanding. Thank you for watching, subscribe if you care, and don't if you don't, because second channel don't care. That doesn't rhyme. Let me try that again. Give me money on Patreon for kebabs if you're liking this series. I use some of that money to give to my editor, but most of it goes on kebabs, don't worry. We're still getting a high kebab count, even though we're not invading Iceland for it, so hope you enjoyed this one. Goodbye.